A solitary man stands in a silent, sun-baked field. His hands are calloused, gripping an 8-foot wooden pole. He too saved Israel. That is, Judges chapter 3, verse 31. 32 words in English. One breath. And then the biblical narrative simply moves on. Once you see what God is doing with Shamgar, you realize you are looking at a master blueprint that stretches across the entire biblical narrative. The specific object changes, but the hidden mechanism of deliverance remains exactly the same. Step back and look at the architecture of biblical history. Centuries earlier, a stuttering fugitive was hiding in the Midianite desert when a bush caught fire. God commanded him to march into Egypt and bring the greatest superpower on earth to its knees. When Moses protested, looking for military credentials and a logical strategy, God simply pointed to the piece of dead wood in the man's hand and asked, "What is that in your hand?" It was just a shepherd's staff, a tool for guiding sheep. But that ordinary staff would soon strike the Nile River and part the waters of the Red Sea. Generations later, a teenage boy steps into the valley of Elah to face a heavily armored Philistine champion. The boy refuses the heavy bronze armor and the forged iron sword of King Saul. Instead, he reaches into a cold stream, pulls out 5 smooth stones, and places them in a shepherd's leather sling. Just a few chapters after Shamgar, Samson will find himself trapped and surrounded by 1,000 Philistines. With absolutely no weapon at all, he reaches down into the dirt, picks up the discarded jawbone of a donkey, and unleashes absolute devastation. The book of Judges is filled with epic, sprawling narratives of flawed heroes and miraculous deliverance. Gideon gets 3 full chapters of real estate. The pattern extends all the way into the New Testament. A massive crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, is starving on a remote hillside. The disciples frantically calculate the financial cost of the crisis and declare the situation physically impossible. Jesus bypasses their mathematics entirely. He takes a peasant boy's lunch of 5 small barley loaves and 2 dried fish, breaks them with his hands, and feeds a multitude. Notice what keeps repeating. A staff, a stone, a jawbone, a loaf, an ox goad. This is not an accident. It is an intentional theological strategy. If God used a fully equipped, heavily armored Iron Age army to defeat the Philistine raiders, the surrounding nations would simply credit the victory to superior metallurgy, brilliant military tactics, and human strength. The deliverance would become a monument to human engineering. God intentionally and consistently bypasses conventional military might so that the credit cannot be stolen. He chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and the weak things to confound the strong. The very inadequacy of the object is precisely what makes it useful to God. But recognizing a theological pattern from a comfortable distance does not erase the physical terror of the moment. We can talk about the rich symbolism of the ox goad in a Bible study, but Shamgar still had to swing it. Up to this point, our question has been historical and linguistic. We have identified his mysterious name and analyzed his crude tool. We read about his deep doubts, his fleece on the threshing floor, his water-drinking test for his soldiers, and his midnight attack with torches and trumpets. But now the stakes escalate into pure survival. Even if God empowers the ordinary, the math of this specific verse is staggering. 600 men is not a minor skirmish. It is a slaughter. How does one solitary farmer, holding a piece of wood, actually execute a victory of this magnitude? The text forces us to look away from the theology and face the brutal nature of the conflict itself. The number sits in the middle of the single verse, like an immovable stone, 600. We read large numbers in the Bible so often that they easily lose their physical weight. We skim past them to reach the end of the story. But stop and visualize the terrifying mathematics of this encounter. Imagine standing alone in an open valley, feeling the vibration in the ground before you hear the sound. 600 trained warriors. That is not a petty gang of local bandits. It is a massive military battalion. That is 1,200 boots hitting the dry earth. A wall of bronze shields and the deafening clatter of forged iron swords moving toward your home. A raiding unit of this magnitude suggests a highly coordinated, devastating objective. The Philistines were not merely passing through the territory. They were coming to strip an entire region of its food supply. If they succeeded, the grain would be stolen, the livestock slaughtered. Samson receives 4 chapters detailing his miraculous birth, his riddles, his immense physical strength, and his tragic collapse. Even Ehud, the assassin who immediately precedes Shamgar, and the Israelite families would slowly starve as winter approached. The stakes were not about political pride. The stakes were absolute survival. When we picture biblical battles, we usually imagine heavily choreographed, holy wars planned far in advance with trumpets and burning altars. We expect a charismatic leader delivering a rousing speech to the gathered tribes. But Shamgar's situation is entirely different. There is no time to plan. There is no time to send for reinforcements from the neighboring villages. He is likely standing on his own threshing floor, his muscles already aching from a full day of grueling agricultural labor. The sweat is on his brow. The dust of the grain is in his lungs. And suddenly the horizon turns dark. He is pushed to the absolute breaking point. In that terrifying fraction of a second, Shamgar has a choice. He can drop his farming tool, abandon his harvest, and run for the winding, hidden paths of the hill country like everyone else has done for years. He can let the enemy take what he has worked so hard to build. Or he can stand his ground. The victory was not born from a brilliant, premeditated military strategy. It was born from a sudden, divinely empowered moment of ordinary obedience. In the face of immediate threat, he did not wait for a perfect weapon. He did not wait until the odds were in his favor. Gets a tense, highly detailed narrative about a hidden dagger and an overweight king. But Shamgar? He achieves a military victory on par with the greatest, or until he received a formal title from the religious elite. He simply gripped the heavy oak shaft of his ox goad, dug his sandals into the dirt, and refused to retreat. He took the only thing he had and pushed back. The biblical text does not provide the logistical details of the combat. It does not tell us whether he funneled the raiders into a narrow mountain pass where their superior numbers meant nothing, or whether this was a grueling, prolonged guerrilla campaign that lasted for weeks across the territory. The writer is not interested in the tactical mechanics. The writer is only interested in the final, impossible casualty count. 600 armed men fell to a solitary farmer. The sheer absurdity of the outcome forces the reader to recognize a profound reality. The power to stop the invasion was not found in the grain of the wood. It was not found in the physical muscle of the man wielding it. The power belonged entirely to the God who met him in the exact moment he refused to run. But this historical reality brings us to the most uncomfortable question for modern readers. We are not facing Philistine raiders in a physical valley, and we do not carry ancient agricultural tools. Where do we fit into a violent, desperate story from the Bronze Age? Champions of the ancient world. He stops a massive, invading force. He secures the freedom of God's people. And for all of this, he receives only a comma. We do not live in the ancient hill country. We do not face literal iron swords. But the human instinct to hide when we are overwhelmed has not changed in 3,000 years. When pressure mounts, when a sudden crisis hits your family, when a terrifying medical diagnosis arrives, when a financial collapse threatens, to strip everything you have built, what is your first response? You look at the threat, you look at your own hands, and you calculate your resources. And, almost always, the calculation leads to despair. We conclude that we do not have enough. We suffer from a modern, quiet paralysis. We convince ourselves that faithfulness requires ideal conditions. We believe that if God really wanted us to step into a difficult conversation, heal a fractured relationship, or confront a deeply rooted anxiety, He would have given us better tools. We wait for a clearer calling. We wait for a perfect background. We wait for a forged iron sword to magically appear in our hands, completely ignoring the ox goad leaning against the wall. We live in a culture that idolizes elite resources. We believe that true impact requires a massive platform. That spiritual influence requires a pristine theological pedigree, and that overcoming. The problem is not that the verse is unclear. The problem is that we stop reading too early. Because of its brevity, most readers assume Shamgar, a personal crisis, requires flawless emotional strength. We want to be a fully armored warrior. We do not want to be a tired farmer holding a dirty stick. So, we stay paralyzed. We wait in the shadows of the ravines, keeping off the main roads, hoping a professional will eventually arrive to handle the threat. What are you trying to control? What have you mistaken for faith? When it is actually just waiting for a more comfortable set of circumstances, think about the specific limitation you are using as an excuse to retreat. Perhaps you feel disqualified by your history. You feel like an outsider. Convinced your past mistakes make you useless to God, just like the son of Anath. Perhaps you look at your daily work, your mundane, repetitive labor of raising children, writing emails, or swinging a hammer and assume it holds no spiritual weight. You look at the overwhelming size of the problem in front of you, and then you look at your own crude, unimpressive resources. The math simply does not work. But this is where the story of Shamgar violently confronts our excuses. The central contrast of this passage is not about military strategy. It is about surrender. God does not demand what you do not have. He never asks you to fight a battle using armor he has not provided. He takes exactly what you are already holding. Your current job is just a minor footnote. We treat him like a piece of Bible trivia, a bizarre interruption about a man with a strange weapon. Squeezed awkwardly. Your flawed history. Your limited influence. Your ordinary daily obedience. And he consecrates it. The limitation is not a barrier to his power. The limitation is the exact starting point. Faithfulness in an ordinary week does not mean waiting for the heavens to part. It means digging your feet into the dirt of your actual life. It means taking the mundane instrument of your daily labor, gripping it tightly, and refusing to surrender your ground to fear. The crisis did not create Shamgar's courage. It revealed what happens when a person simply refuses to run. This changes how we view our own inadequacy. The very thing you despise about your life might be the exact instrument God intends to use. But there is one final detail in this single verse that seals this truth permanently. The biblical writer did not just record the weapon and the casualty count. To understand the true weight of this solitary farmer, it all comes back to the final 3 words of the passage. The camera zooms out from the immediate terror of the valley to the grand scope of biblical history. Over the centuries, Israel will be led by towering figures. Moses will part the sea with a staff. Joshua will bring down the walls of Jericho with the blast of a ram's horn. Between the major deliverers, we want our biblical heroes properly vetted. We expect a divine calling, like Moses at the burning bush, or an angelic visitation. David will build an empire with a sword. These men will have chapters, scrolls, and entire books dedicated to their lives, their complex prayers, and their brilliant military strategies. Shamgar receives exactly 32 words in a single breath. But look closely at how the biblical writer concludes that brief. Violent interruption. After the battle is over, the text does not offer a lesser category of victory. It does not append an asterisk next to his name. It simply states, "He too saved Israel." That short phrase elevates a Hurrian outsider, a man with a pagan-linked title holding a dirty farming tool, to the exact same status as the greatest champions of the Hebrew faith. He is placed seamlessly alongside Ehud, Gideon, and Samson. In the divine ledger, the length of your biography does not determine the weight of your faithfulness. God does not measure significance by the size of your platform, the purity of your past, or the elegance of your resources. The entire mystery of Shamgar compresses into 3 enduring truths. First, God's power is not hindered by an imperfect background. He redeems the outsider. Second, God intentionally bypasses the elite, intimidating resources of the world to prove that deliverance comes only from his hand. Like Gideon at the winepress, we want a clear theological pedigree. Shamgar has none of this. There is no recorded prayer. There is no mention. And third, isolated faithfulness in an obscure field holds the exact same eternal value as leadership on a global stage. Imagine the aftermath in that sun-baked valley. The deafening clash of iron and the terrifying vibration of 1,200 boots finally fade into silence. The 600 raiders are defeated. The harvest remains secure. The abandoned, winding paths of the hill country will soon be empty again, because the people will finally return to the main roads. The solitary farmer stands quietly in the field. He walks back to his modest home, wipes the sweat and dust from his face, and takes the heavy oak pole in his hands. He leans the ox goad against a stone wall. It is the exact same object we saw at the beginning of the story. It still has the sharp iron tip on one end and the flat chisel on the other. It is still covered in the mud of the threshing floor, but its meaning has been permanently transformed. It is no longer a symbol of Philistine oppression and economic starvation. It is no longer a peasant's crude tool of subjugation. It has become an eternal monument to divine salvation. This is the central contrast of his life, and it is the direct challenge to yours. This was never a story about military strategy. The earth beneath his sandals is dry, and the harvest he has labored over for months is finally ready. Of the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him, in this specific text, there is just a violent, desperate collision of a man, a farming tool, or discovering a brilliant new technique to defeat your giants. It is a story about the radical consecration of the ordinary. You do not need to wait for ideal conditions. You do not need to rewrite your history or apologize for the mundane realities of your daily work. Look at the specific field you have been assigned. Look at the ordinary, unimpressive tool already resting in your hands. Lift it up. Stand your ground. And refuse to surrender to the fear. God is not looking for a flawless warrior, holding an iron sword. He is looking for an ordinary person willing to swing the wood. And an army. But the biblical writers did not waste ink. And they did not waste space. The central question is not merely how a farmer defeated a garrison. The deeper question is why this specific man, holding this specific object, was permanently recorded in the sacred text. This is not ultimately a story about military strategy. It is a story about the divine consecration of the ordinary. To unlock what is actually happening in this verse, we cannot start with the battle. We have to start with the man. And if we slow down and look closely at the very first word of his story, his name, a massive historical contradiction immediately appears. The text leaves a clue right on the surface. A detail that shatters everything we assume about the kind of people God chooses to use. To understand how he saved a nation, we first have to translate his identity. The only other time Shamgar's name is spoken in Scripture, it is sung as a lament. To translate his identity, we must look 2 chapters forward, into the famous Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5. The prophetess Deborah is singing a historical record of Israel's darkest days. And in verse 6, she gives us a terrifying glimpse into the exact conditions of the world Shamgar inhabited. She sings, "In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath," but in the distance, a terrifying dust cloud rises on the horizon. The sound of iron weapons and approaching boots breaks the quiet of the valley. In the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths. Step back and look at the physical reality of that single sentence. The main roads of Israel were completely empty. No merchants moving grain. No families traveling for the religious feasts. No children playing near the city gates. The sound of footsteps on a paved highway had become an absolute death sentence. To survive, travelers abandoned the open roads and took to the hidden, winding paths of the hill country. They moved through the heavy brush, hiding in the shadows of the ravines, slipping through the valleys in silence just to fetch water or visit a neighboring village. This was not merely a political dispute where a foreign empire collected taxes from a comfortable distance. This was daily, suffocating terror. The Philistines were a sophisticated, heavily armed seafaring people who had settled along the Mediterranean coast. They possessed a severe military, Advantage: iron technology. Later in the historical record, we learn that the Philistines actually outlawed blacksmithing in Israel. They forced the Israelites to travel down to the Philistine cities just to sharpen their agricultural tools, charging exorbitant prices to ensure the Hebrews remained impoverished and completely defenseless. The Israelites were effectively trapped in the Bronze Age, facing a fully armored Iron Age empire. Because of this, fear gripped the entire countryside. The local economy was paralyzed. Agriculture became a desperate, dangerous gamble. To plant a field meant you were tethered to it, exposed and visible to the coastal raiding parties that swept through the... It is a Philistine raiding party, 600 men strong. In the ancient world, these raids were not formal. Military campaigns fought on distant battlefields, valleys, precisely at harvest time. The Israelites were supposed to be living in the Promised Land, a land of rest and abundance. Instead, they were living like hunted animals in their own inheritance. The oppression had created a permanent culture of hiding. Every unexpected rustle of the trees, every distant cloud of dust on the horizon, sent a spike of panic through an Israelite village. The people had surrendered the public spaces to the enemy. It is easy to read the Book of Judges from a distance as a clean series of theological cycles. Israel sins. God allows oppression. Israel cries out. God sends a deliverer. But when we zoom in on the human scene, the cycle loses its neat academic structure. It feels like slow starvation. It feels like the constant, low-grade anxiety of never knowing if the food you labored to grow will actually be allowed to feed your children. This is the frozen, terrified world Shamgar wakes up in on the day of the raid. The highways are dead. The people are hiding. The enemy holds a total monopoly on military power. The familiar interpretation of Scripture tells us that when things get this dark, God raises up a prophet or a royal champion. We expect someone from the powerful tribe of Judah, a man with a pure lineage who can blow a ram's horn and rally the armies of God. But the silence of the abandoned roads is not broken by a Hebrew prince. It is broken by a man who does not fit the mold of "they were sudden" brutal acts of localized terror. The invaders waited until the Israelites had done the grueling work of growing and threshing the grain, a biblical savior at all. The name Deborah sings in her lament, Shamgar, son of Anath, holds a jarring historical secret. When we examine the origin of those words, the hidden contradiction of this story finally reveals itself. Who exactly was the man holding the weapon? If you were an Israelite, hiding in the hill country, praying for God to send a deliverer, the name of the man who finally arrived would have made you profoundly uncomfortable. We read the name Shamgar and assume he is just another Hebrew leader, perhaps from the tribe of Judah or Ephraim. But the text does not state that. In fact, the linguistic evidence points in the exact opposite direction. Let us look closely at the Hebrew words Shamgar, ben Anath Shamgar, son of Anath. When we read this in English, it sounds like a standard biblical genealogy. It sounds exactly like David, son of Jesse, or Joshua, son of Nun. We assume Anath is simply his human father, but the original audience would have heard something entirely different. And the translation loses a shocking cultural nuance. First, the name Shamgar is not Hebrew. It is a Hurrian name. It belongs to a people group from the north, outside the covenant family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the detail that cuts deepest comes next. Anath was not a Hebrew man. Anath was a major Canaanite deity, and then they swept in like locusts, taking the food and leaving the families to starve. The man in the field does not have a sword. She was the brutal, terrifying goddess of war, conflict, and fertility. In the ancient Ugaritic texts discovered by archaeologists, Anath is famously depicted laughing as she wades up to her knees in the blood of her defeated enemies. She represented the exact pagan idolatry that Israel was commanded to reject. Scholars continue to debate the precise historical meaning of the phrase, son of Anath. Some believe it means Shamgar was a literal foreigner, a Canaanite whose parents named him in honor of their violent goddess. Others argue that son of Anath was not a biological genealogy at all, but a well-known mercenary military title. In the ancient Near East, an elite warrior might be called a son of Anath, similar to how a modern special forces unit might adopt an intimidating mythic nickname. Either way, the implication is staggering. The man who stepped between Israel and the Philistine army was not a purebred Hebrew priest. He was not a polished, orthodox insider. He was highly likely a non-Israelite outsider, or at the very least, a mercenary, bearing a pagan-linked title. This creates a massive theological contradiction. The Israelites were currently suffering precisely because they had compromised with Canaanite gods. And yet, the instrument God chooses to save them bears the name of a Canaanite goddess. It feels wrong. He does not have armor. He does not have an army. He only has the farming tool in his hands. This is the story of Shamgar. We want God's deliverers to be untainted, doctrinally precise, and culturally acceptable. We assume God requires a perfect, untarnished vessel to accomplish a holy purpose. But the text refuses to sanitize the story. By placing a Hurrian name and a pagan title right in the middle of the sacred history, the biblical writer is forcing us to realize that God is not limited by our religious categories. He does not need a pristine background to enact his will. If he could use a pagan king like Cyrus, centuries later, to rebuild the temple, he could use a rough, questionable outsider to stop a Philistine raid. Why would God use an outsider connected to a foreign deity to deliver his chosen people? The answer is not found in his genealogy. The answer is found in the physical reality of the battle. It is connected not to his pedigree, but to the object he carried, an 8-foot shaft of heavy oak or cypress. At one end, a sharp iron tip. At the other, a flat metal chisel. When you hear the word ox goad, do not picture a sophisticated weapon of war. Picture a heavy, crude instrument of grueling daily labor. To understand the sheer impossibility of Shamgar's victory, we have to examine the physical anatomy of the object he was holding. In the ancient Near East, the ox goad was designed for two highly specific agricultural tasks. The sharp point, the goad itself, was used. But if you turn the pages of your Bible too quickly, you will completely miss him, his entire life, his defining battle, and his national salvation, to prick the hindquarters of a massive, stubborn ox. A farmer used it to force a 1,000-pound beast of burden to keep moving in a straight line under a heavy wooden yoke. The flat iron blade on the opposite end served a different purpose. As the plow tore through the earth, thick clay, rocks, and roots would clump against the blade. The farmer would flip the goad around and use the flat chisel to scrape the plowshare clean. The ox goad was constantly covered in mud, sweat, and dirt. It was an implement of subjugation, designed to drive a beast forward. So why was Shamgar holding a farming tool instead of a spear? Because he had no other choice. As we established, the Philistines controlled the iron industry. Decades later, during the reign of King Saul, the book of 1 Samuel explicitly records the brutal reality of this monopoly. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." The Philistines allowed the Israelites to own plowshares, mattocks, axes, and ox goads, but they strictly prohibited actual weapons. They made sure the Hebrews remained a society of defenseless peasants. Shamgar carried an ox goad because it was the only piece of metal the empire legally allowed him to hold. Now, place that object into the context of Judges chapter 3. Imagine the terrifying visual collision of this scene. 600 Philistines are advancing, are compressed into exactly one verse. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. These are professional raiders, likely equipped with bronze helmets, scale armor, heavy shields, and forged iron swords. They are a highly organized, lethal military force, trained for slaughter. Standing against them is a solitary man holding a dirty stick with a small metal tip. The visual disparity is absurd. The math does not work. But this is exactly where the theology of the passage shifts. The Philistines allowed the ox goad because they believed it was harmless. They looked at it as a symbol of Israel's technological inferiority and economic subjugation. But the enemy drastically misunderstood what happens when ordinary things are surrendered to a sovereign God. The very tool meant to signify their oppression became the instrument of their defeat. Shamgar did not wait for a sword to fall from the sky. He did not ask for a chariot. He took the mud-stained tool of his daily labor, lifted it against a professional army, and violently repurposed it. In the hands of the Spirit, a tool of peasant labor is transformed into an instrument of liberation. But this is not just a clever use of farming equipment in an isolated emergency. This single sentence about a man and his ox goad is actually a signpost pointing to something much larger. It reveals a massive biblical architecture, a specific way God prefers to work throughout history. The ox goad swinging through the air in that sun-baked valley is not an isolated anomaly. It is a divine signature.